I grew up in a quiet village in the Bavarian Alps. It was one of those places where everyone knows everyone, and nothing ever happens until that night. I was 12 years old when my friend Max and I decided to camp near the old abandoned castle on the edge of the forest. The castle had been uninhabited for decades, and the villagers told stories about it being haunted. Of course, we didn't believe in such things, but the thought of spending a night near such a mysterious place was too tempting to ignore. We pitched our tent and made a small campfire to keep warm. The moon shone brightly above the treetops, and everything seemed peaceful. But as midnight approached, the atmosphere changed. The air grew colder, and an eerie rustling came from the forest. Max laughed and said it was just animals, but a queasy feeling spread through me. Suddenly, we heard a soft giggle. It was as if a child was playing in the castle. We froze. There were no children nearby, and the castle was abandoned. "Did you hear that?" Max whispered, and I nodded. "Let's go check it out," he finally said, even though at that moment I would have preferred to run home. We grabbed our flashlights and quietly crept towards the castle. The giggling grew louder as we got closer, and then, as we stood before the large entrance door, it suddenly stopped. Max pushed open the heavy, creaking door, and we entered the great hall. The air was icy, and it smelled of old wood and dust. Our steps echoed loudly through the room, but otherwise, it was dead silent. Suddenly, something glinted in the light of my flashlight, a small metal object on the floor. It was an old doll, dirty and worn, with a smile that didn't seem fitting for a peaceful toy. "That's creepy," Max said and wanted to pick up the doll, but at that moment, a deafening screech echoed from the depths of the castle. We dropped the doll and ran as fast as we could back to the tent. When we reached the tent, I noticed something strange. On my arm, there was a small red mark, as if someone had touched me with tiny fingers. Max and I never spoke about that night again, but every time I look back at the old castle, I wonder who or what was playing with us inside. I was born and raised in Hampshire, a small and beautiful town in England, where life was so quiet that the crime rate was almost zero, and hardly anything extraordinary happened, especially in my village. When the events I'm about to tell you happened, I was 10 years old and lived in a small house with my parents and younger brother. Nearby lived an old lady who aroused the curiosity of everyone in the village. This was Mrs. Margarita, a woman of about 70, who lived in an old wooden house with her young granddaughter, a girl who must have been about my age, but whom no one had ever seen. It was only known that she was there with her because her silhouette could be seen through the window when she was at the table with her grandmother, or rocking in a small rocking chair that Mrs. Margarita apparently had in the living room. Sometimes, she could also be heard laughing and talking to her grandmother, and the latter sang lullabies to her at night. For some reason, however, Margarita never let the girl leave the house, and the girl didn't even go to school, had no contact with other children in the village, and lived completely isolated in that old house, which was surrounded by a high fence, also made of wood but very dilapidated. This attracted great attention from the neighbors, especially the children in the neighborhood, because we were incredibly curious about what the girl looked like and why she never left the house. I remember that we often secretly, without our parents knowing, crept up to the fence to try to see her through the windows, but the only thing we saw was her silhouette. The adults in the village often referred to the old woman as a bad mother because she didn't let the girl out of the house to play with other children. It seemed like she wasn't even allowed to see the sunlight. But although no one knew why Margarita didn't show her granddaughter, there were speculations about the reason. About 9 or 10 years earlier, Mrs. Margarita had experienced a terrible tragedy. In that year, a large forest fire broke out in the village. which destroyed many houses and claimed the lives of several villagers, including, unfortunately, Mrs. Margarita's son and his wife, the girl's parents. According to stories, they had tried everything to save them, but it was in vain. Everyone was literally running for their lives, and no one could do anything for them. Nevertheless, the old woman didn't give up until she managed to enter the burning house. No one could stop her, and although she couldn't do anything to save her son and daughter-in-law, she managed to rescue her young granddaughter, who was only 6 months old at the time, alive. Everyone said it was a true miracle that the girl came out of the fire alive. But since then, Margarita has not let the child out of her sight and didn't want anyone to see her. Therefore, it was believed that the reason why the girl never left her grandmother's house was that the burns she had suffered in that terrible fire were so severe that they left deep scars on her body. And the girl might not want the other children to see her like that and make fun of her. There were numerous speculations about it, and this only made the children's curiosity even greater. In fact, my friends and I had made it a kind of challenge to discover the identity of Margarita's granddaughter. One of the things we often did in my village was to camp outside our homes. Since this area was so quiet and there was literally no crime or danger, our parents allowed us such undertaking. So my friends and I built improvised tents wherever we liked, and stayed there for several days until we got tired of the place and looked for a new one. So it came about that one night, my brother, my friends, and I began to hatch a plan to finally uncover the mystery of the imprisoned girl. I was born and grew up in a small village in Virginia, just a few miles from Washington, D.C. It used to be a very quiet place where most of my neighbors were elderly people who had retired here to enjoy their retirement years. Therefore, there weren't many children to play with. In fact, I was the only child on my street, and you can imagine how much I loved being at school. But my happiness changed when I was 8 years old, the day the Lopez family moved into the house next door. A Mexican couple with 2 children, Fabio, 8 years old, and Marcela, 7 years old. From the day they arrived, these children became my best friends. Every afternoon, we played outside for hours, and often, my mother would bake cookies and serve them to us with milk in the late afternoon before they returned home. But it seemed that things were not going well in the Lopez household. Mr. Ernesto, the children's father, was a very grumpy, violent man with obvious alcohol problems, and he was often heard shouting, both at his children and his wife. The arguments were frequent, and you could hear blows and crying. But there was one incident that was particularly frightening. One night, when Mr. Lopez came home drunk again and the arguments began, we heard a shotgun go off, followed by a lot of screaming. This prompted my parents and some neighbors, fearing the worst, to go to the door to see what had happened. After knocking several times, Mrs. Ma finally opened the door a crack. According to my parents, she looked terrified, and her voice betrayed her nervousness. When the neighbors asked about the origin of the shot, she quickly explained that it was just an accident. Her husband had been trying to clean the gun, and it had gone off accidentally. It was just a scare, but everyone was fine. Of course, her story didn't convince anyone, and the neighbors asked if she needed help or if they should call the police, but she started shaking her head almost frantically, assuring that everything was fine. The next day, the children came out to play as usual, and we rode our bikes around the neighborhood. However, I noticed that Fabio and Marcela had bruises on their arms. So, with the naivety of an 8-year-old, I asked them directly if their father hit them. Both looked at each other in alarm and remained silent. But I didn't stop and told them that everyone suspected it. Thereupon, they stopped their bikes and told me they had to go home. I didn't understand their sudden change in behavior at the time and told them that it was still early afternoon, but they only repeated that they had to go home and rode back. I remember that it was a Saturday, Mr. Lopez's favorite day to go out with his friends, and also one of the days when things at home often escalated. But that night, there were no arguments, no bangs against the walls, which seemed strange to us, but also pleasing. The next day, the Lopez children didn't come out to play as usual, and their mother, who never left the house anyway, also remained invisible. Later, we learned that Mrs. Mara had taken advantage of her husband's absence that Saturday to flee the house with her children and move to another city. I was sad about the news because I knew that I wouldn't see my friends again, but at the same time, I was relieved to know that they would no longer be abused by their father. After this incident, Mr. Lopez's life changed drastically. The man began to drink incessantly, eventually lost his job, and roamed around the neighborhood drunk and disheveled. He was practically homeless until a year later he took his own life in that house, which didn't really surprise anyone. After Mr. Lopez's death, the house remained uninhabited for 12 years until it was bought by a foundation that wanted to build a retirement home there. But when construction work began, a gruesome discovery was made. In the garden behind the house, the bodies of a woman and 2 children were found. It wasn't difficult to find out that it was Mrs. Martha and her 2 children, my childhood friends. The discovery caused great horror in the community, and a later forensic investigation revealed that their throats had been cut, probably while they were sleeping, as they were still wearing their pajamas. Now it was clear why there had been no sounds on that fateful night. In 2014, when I was 16 years old, new neighbors moved into the house across the street. It was Anna and Arthur Moore, a middle-aged, childless couple. The Moores were very attractive and financially well off, but somehow there was a strange, dark aura around them, especially around Anna. From the moment I first saw them, I felt a great curiosity because they seemed perfect, like some kind of Barbie and Ken in their 30s and with a hint of gothic, but my instinct immediately sounded an alarm. And this never deceives me. I knew that something about them was not right, so I set out to find out. Although I'm not particularly proud of it, I must confess that I started to spy on them. From my bedroom window, I had a good view of their house. You could see a large part of the living room and the huge kitchen, as well as the master bedroom and a large part of the garden. I also found that this was the perfect time to bring out the old binoculars that Santa Claus had given me when I was 8 years old. At first, everything seemed very normal. Their daily activities were similar to those of a very ordinary couple. Arthur got up early and went jogging every morning. Then he would return, shower, I assume, have breakfast in the kitchen with Anna, and then go to work. Anna, on the other hand, didn't seem to have a job since she was always at home. The first 2 weeks passed without any particular incidents, but one day I noticed something very strange. Anna Moore left the house early and returned with some shopping bags, but besides these, I noticed 2 particularly strange things. She opened the trunk and took out a large amount of bags from a well-known textile shop in the city, a shop where my mother often bought materials when I had theater performances at school or similar thing. You're probably wondering what's so strange about that. Well, it was strange because it was meters and meters of black velvet and thick cords, also black, but that wasn't all. Among the supermarket purchases, there were 2 large boxes of black candles and 2 more with something that looked like incense. But the most disturbing thing was the last thing Anna took out of the car, a large box wrapped in some kind of cloth, which seemed to be quite heavy. She placed it on the floor for a moment, and suddenly, the box began to move. When I saw that, I jumped up because I hadn't expected that. If the box was moving, it meant that whatever was inside was alive. All of this was extremely disturbing, but it was only the beginning of a series of strange events. That same afternoon, a luxurious SUV parked in front of the Moore's house, and two well-dressed men got out. They were carrying something that looked like a large dog food bag, but I had never seen a dog in the Moore's house. After a few minutes, the men left the house again, carrying with them the velvet bags and cords. For a moment, I thought they had also taken the box that had moved, but that wasn't the case. They only took the bags and drove away. A few days after this incident, on Sunday of the same week, a group of cars parked in front of the Moore's house. It seemed as if they were having some kind of meeting. There were about 15 people spread across several vehicles, and among them were the men I had seen the day before. They brought several bags with them that looked like long black garments, more like robes. When I saw all of this, I really wished that it was a themed party with a gothic theme or something like that, but there was never any music or anything that resembled a celebration. Rather, it reminded me of a funeral. It was clear to me that the Moors were connected to some kind of sect that was involved in the occult, although I didn't know exactly whether it was something satanic or witchcraft. The most disturbing thing happened later, around 1 a.m. You could hear strange chants and noises from the house, but they were very quiet, almost like whispers, so probably no one else was aware of them. What was clearly audible, however, was a sound that sounded like the bleating of a goat, at least it seemed so to me. The first thing that came to my mind was the large box that had moved. The thought that the animal inside was being sacrificed made my blood run cold and broke my heart at the same time. That night, I stayed awake the whole time. I was so fixated on what was happening in the Moore's house that I couldn't sleep. That's why I was also able to witness what happened after that dark meeting. Around 5 a.m., as dawn was breaking, the guests began to leave the house, and I saw them loading several black garbage bags into the trunks of some car, something that strongly caught my attention. At the time, I was very absorbed in my role as a detective. At first, it all started as a game because, somehow, it was very exciting for me to spy on my neighbors and discover their dark secrets. I felt like the main character in a mystery film, but sometimes reality surpasses fiction, and that was definitely the case here. In the weeks and months that followed, these events repeated themselves, and the Moors' Sunday rituals were soon no secret anymore. At some point, practically the entire neighborhood knew about their connections to dark magic, and although no one said anything, many suspected that Anna was some kind of witch or priestess. When the secret life of the Moors was no longer a secret, I lost interest in them and stopped observing them. It didn't make sense if there was no mystery left to solve. But a few years later, a shocking event occurred that shook the whole neighborhood and drew attention to the Moors again. One morning, around 5 a.m., the desperate cries for help of a man were heard. My parents jumped out of bed and ran into the street to find out who it was and what had happened. In the process, they noticed that the cries were coming from the Moors' house, so they ran there, as did other neighbors. I wanted to follow them, but my mother held me back because she thought it might be dangerous, so I stayed on the porch of our house and waited for them to return. But then, 2 patrol cars and an ambulance arrived. When I saw that, I immediately knew that it was serious, and it was, because what happened that morning was that Anna, possessed by a ghost, stabbed her husband twice in the chest while he was sleeping. Fortunately, Arthur's wounds were not deep enough to endanger his life, and he was discharged from the hospital after a few days. Anna, on the other hand, was arrested, and I learned that she was forced to begin psychiatric treatment. After this incident, the Moors never returned to their house, which was empty for a while until it was finally sold to a Christian family, which was quite curious. Nevertheless, I never heard from them again. About 10 years ago, I moved to an old neighborhood in San Francisco. It was a very cheerful place where everyone knew each other, and there was a good atmosphere. Right from the start, I noticed that there were some people in this neighborhood who were kind of symbols of the place, and everyone knew and appreciated them. One of them was Mrs. Amelia, a friendly old lady who watered her plants every morning and, in the process, held a small open-air concert in which she also dedicated a funny poem to everyone who passed by. She was one of those people who made this place special, and everyone loved her very much. Another well-known neighbor was Niccolo, an Italian who ran the most popular cafe in the area. No wonder, because this man made the most delicious bread you could ever taste. He was also very charming and had a great sense of humor. But without a doubt, the most striking, so to speak, neighbor was Frank, a man of about 60 who had worked as an art teacher at the school for over 30 years. He was known for his great cultural work and for turning his own house into a kind of open-air museum on symbolic days. For example, on Independence Day, he put plaster figures in his front yard that he had made himself. He did the same on Easter and Christmas, but what attracted the most attention was what he did on Halloween. Every year, he not only decorated his garden with cobwebs, but also placed a huge, spooky Grim Reaper figure with a scythe raised high in the middle of the garden. What was really eerie, however, was that around it, a lot of faceless rag dolls in tattered clothes were hanging, which looked like zombies and gave the impression that they were hanged children. More than creepy, this scene was rather disturbing. The first time I saw it, I felt very uncomfortable, but Frank later explained to me that this was an artistic representation that symbolized the cruelty of the world towards children. Each doll represented a child who had fallen victim to human wickedness and whose life had been ended prematurely, hence the figure of the Grim Reaper, who seemed to be chasing them. When I heard Frank's explanation, I understood a little better what he was trying to illustrate, but that didn't make it any less disturbing because, after all, not everyone who passed by would understand it that way. Besides, I couldn't help but feel a certain mistrust. I had seen too many thrillers and crime series not to think that something much darker could be hiding behind it all. Frank lived alone since his wife had died over 15 years ago, and he had never remarried. He was a pleasant guy and enjoyed a lot of respect and recognition in the neighborhood. The children loved him because he was like a kind of African-American Santa Claus who always gave them sweets and made toys and dolls for them. He also gave the children private lessons in fine arts at his home, which worried me. One day, an incident occurred that alarmed everyone. A boy from the neighborhood had disappeared. His mother was completely distraught, and everyone was deeply shaken by the situation. The little boy had left the house early in the morning to go to school, which was only a few streets away, but he never arrived there. His mother immediately called the police, and a search for the child was launched. Everyone joined the search as volunteers, including Frank, who seemed concerned, as the boy was also his student. I couldn't help but suspect him. In fact, I had no reason to think badly of Frank, but when I was little, a neighbor and family friend had tried to abuse me. That was very traumatic for me, and since then, I have been very suspicious. That's why, when I saw Frank's disturbing Halloween display, I couldn't help but think that this was perhaps the projection of his dark side. That he might be like the neighbor I had back then who wanted to hurt me. At that moment, a million things went through my head. Hours passed, and the 9-year-old boy didn't turn up. Panic began to spread, and I became increasingly restless. I didn't stop watching old Frank, hoping to see some sign or indication that he had something to do with the disappearance. After several fruitless hours, I couldn't hold back any longer and called one of the policemen to tell him about my suspicions. He listened to me attentively and asked if I was sure of what I was saying. Of course, I said that I wasn't, because I had no evidence, but I told him about the dolls on Halloween and what I thought about it. Shortly afterward, the police asked for permission to search the houses, arguing that the boy might still be in the neighborhood. Although my neighbors looked at each other, everyone agreed, including Frank. But whether it was because of my persistent gaze, which I was unconsciously directing at him, or because he had seen me talking to the police, or simply because of his old fox nature. When the officers suggested searching his house first, his gaze shot straight to me. It was a kind of accusing look that made me nervous for a moment, but I returned it to show him that I didn't trust him. The police entered his house and searched it from top to bottom, but found nothing. Only dolls, paintings, puppets, paints, and art supplies, as well as his personal belongings. There was nothing to indicate that the boy had ever been there or any other child. When the police officers came out again without any results, Frank gave me another look, as if he had slapped me. I was very surprised because I was really convinced that he had the boy or had done something bad to him. The officers searched several other houses but found nothing. But almost in the late afternoon, while I was just making myself a sandwich, I saw a patrol car stop in front of my neighbor's house, and her son got out, safe and sound. Fortunately, it turned out that the boy had deliberately skipped school and had gone with a group of friends to a skateboard competition in another neighborhood. When I learned that, I was very relieved that the boy was safe, but at the same time, a deep feeling of shame overcame me. I had no idea how I would ever look Frank in the eye again. At that moment, I just wanted to pack my things and disappear from this place forever. But the next day, I received an unexpected visit. Yes, it was Frank. When I saw through the peephole that it was him, I considered not opening the door, but I finally did. After all, you have to take responsibility for your mistakes. So I invited him in and offered him a coffee. We talked for quite a while. Of course, I apologized, and fortunately, he accepted the apology. In this conversation, I was honest with him about what I thought and what I had experienced myself. After a while, listening to his anecdotes and getting to know him a little better, I realized how prejudiced I had been and how badly I had judged him for no reason. Over time, I realized that old Frank was really as good a person as everyone said, and to this day, we are good friends. Diego and I lived in a nice neighborhood. He was my neighbor and my best friend since kindergarten, so I thought there was nothing we hid from each other, or at least I thought so. Diego was a pretty attractive guy and came from a wealthy family, so it was no wonder that all the girls were crazy about him. Every time we went out together, I felt inferior because he always got all the attention, and I was just the friend of the good-looking guy. Nevertheless, he was always very reserved, conservative, and serious when it came to relationships. He could have been a Don Juan, but he was more of the romantic type who was looking for a deep connection with his partner and valued stable relationships. I remember often teasing him about it. I always told him that he was like a Disney princess trapped in Tom Cruise's body because he somehow looked like him. Although he had dated some girls, there was one who became his great crush from the moment he saw her. Barbara Estrada, a tall, blonde, and beautiful girl who was in high school with us. She didn't know it, but Diego was crazy about her, but he didn't dare tell her because she was dating another guy at the time, Hector, the star of the wrestling team and a real ruffian. At first, I encouraged him to approach Barbara and try to win her over, but then I remembered who she was with and realized that it wasn't a good idea. But as they say, God's timing is perfect, although in this case, I believe that Satan pulled the strings, because a few years later, when Diego was studying medicine, he met Barbara again. This happened one night when we met up after some time without contact, as each of us was pursuing our own studies. He was studying medicine, and I was studying law, but every now and then, we found time to meet up, go out, and reminisce. On that evening, we ran into Barbara by chance, who was celebrating with a group of girlfriends. Now in our 20s, Diego was no longer as shy as he had been in school, especially not after a few drinks. So, this time he didn't just limit himself to watching her from afar, but went over to her, and they started talking, and later they danced together. Meanwhile, I was flirting with one of her friends. Since that night, Diego and Barbara dated, and they started a relationship. I swear, I had never seen Diego so happy with anyone, and that made me happy. He was completely in love with her, and she seemed to be too. They were the perfect couple, the envy of everyone else, but things were about to change drastically. Diego was a hopeless romantic, so after only 8 months of dating, he planned a surprise party at his parents' house where he proposed to Barbara. I was completely shocked when I saw him get down on one knee and present her with the ring, especially because he hadn't told me anything about it. Probably because he knew that I would try to stop him, because it seemed far too early. I was sure that he loved her very much. How could it be otherwise? He had been waiting for her for years, but I wasn't so sure how deep Barbara's feelings for him were and whether she was really ready to share a life with him. But she accepted the proposal, and they got engaged. Shortly after the engagement party, Diego's parents moved to another city and left him the house. It wasn't long before he invited Barbara to move in with him. I didn't know exactly how to feel about this. Both were still very young. Diego was 24, and Barbara was only 21. It all seemed very rushed. Besides, this relationship seemed too good to be true for Barbara right from the start. Diego showered her with expensive gifts, paid her bills, and fulfilled her every wish. He never hesitated when it came to making her happy, which seemed exaggerated to me, but Diego was blinded by love. For the first 5 months, everything went well. They were now my neighbors, and I often saw them, although I gave them their space. Both were excited about the upcoming wedding. Diego dreamed of finally marrying his great love, while Barbara seemed much more excited about the party, the dress, and all the wedding preparation. Sometimes, I thought that she was only interested in the wedding and the honeymoon, while Diego was in love with the marriage. But things started to change when Abraham, Diego's older brother, came to town for business, and Diego asked him to stay at his place. Abraham was the exact opposite of Diego. He had the charm, the self-confidence, and the cunning that Diego lacked. He was also very attractive and a real womanizer. Diego was overjoyed because he hadn't seen his brother for years, as he lived in another city. I was less enthusiastic because Abraham and I had had a few arguments in the past. He had a habit of being interested in other men's girlfriends, but at that time, we were both still teenagers, and I hoped that maturity had changed him. Unfortunately, I was wrong. From the moment Diego introduced Barbara to Abraham, I noticed the mischief in Abraham's eyes, and what was worse, I noticed that Barbara wasn't indifferent to him either. The whole thing stunk from the beginning, but I couldn't say such a thing to Diego, firstly because he was completely blind with love, and secondly, because they were only my assumption. At that time, there were still 2 months until the wedding, and like me, Diego was also studying, so he spent a lot of time outside the house. Barbara, on the other hand, had taken a break from university to focus entirely on wedding planning, so she spent most of the day at home together with Abraham. I didn't say anything to Diego, but I noticed that something wasn't right, and Abraham seemed to have built a close friendship, as if they had known each other for ages. There seemed to be a kind of familiarity developing between them that I didn't like, but Diego was completely naive, and what was worse, He trusted his girlfriend and his brother blindly. I felt completely helpless because I suspected that this wasn't a normal friendship. Eventually, I couldn't stand it any longer and told Diego what I thought. To my surprise, my friend got angry like never before. He accused me of being jealous of his happiness and wanting to destroy it. He even said that I was in love with his fiancée. But the craziest part was when he ordered me to stay away from him and never talk to him again. He wouldn't allow me to make such vile accusations against Barbara and his brother. I was stunned and couldn't believe what I was hearing. Of course, I was angry, but above all, I felt sorry for him. I knew him well enough to know that he was living in denial and that his anger was actually coming from fear. But sooner or later, the truth comes to light, and unfortunately, Diego would find out that my assumptions were correct in the worst possible way. But what happened after that was something that no one, not even I, could have predicted. A few weeks after our fight, with only 15 days left until the wedding, Diego decided to skip class and come home early to surprise Barbara with a large bouquet of roses. But it was he who was surprised. He found Barbara and his brother asleep in his bed. I didn't have to be there to know that his heart broke into 1,000 pieces at that moment. After his life had collapsed in this way, I would have expected the Diego I knew to confront them. Maybe he would have given his brother a beating and thrown them both out of the house. Surely he would have then come to me to share his pain. But he didn't. Instead, Diego quietly went downstairs, got into his car, and left the house. He returned at his usual time. When he came back, he found them talking to each other as normal, as if nothing had happened. Barbara greeted him, and the three of them had dinner together, as they had done in the past few weeks. But before leaving the dining room, Diego pulled a gun from his bag and unloaded it completely into the bodies of his fiancée and his brother. Afterward, he left the house, went outside, and leaned against the tree in his driveway, where he began to smoke a cigarette. I was at home when everything happened. When I heard the shots, I ran outside to see what had happened. Several of my neighbors had also come out, but there seemed to be nothing unusual except Diego, who was calmly smoking his cigarette. But when I saw him sitting there so calmly, and neither Barbara nor Abraham was outside like everyone else, a cold shiver ran down my spine. I prayed that what I was thinking hadn't happened. But when I approached him and asked what had happened, he only answered, "You were right, they betrayed me." "And what did you do?" I asked him. "I killed them." After he finished his cigarette, Diego called the police, confessed to the crime, and turned himself in. To this day, he is in prison and serving a 24-year sentence. But what worries me most about the whole thing, apart from the crime itself, is that I never saw him cry. I never saw him break down, not even when he was sentenced. To this day, he has shown no remorse or any sign of pain. It's as if he had become another person, or perhaps that dark side was always in him, and I never saw it. I've never been a fan of online dating. It always seemed to me that it was only for two types of people, those who were desperately looking for love and those who wanted to have affairs with everyone. However, this was the opinion of a woman who had been married to the love of her life for 5 years, and who was considered the perfect man by everyone, including me. Unfortunately, perfection doesn't exist, and the more perfect a person seems to be, the darker the secret they hide behind that facade. I had to learn this lesson the hard way when I found out that the man I had fallen in love with and to whom I had sworn eternal love at the altar actually had a penchant for other men. Throughout our relationship, he had cheated on me with countless men whom he had met on exactly these dating sites. As you can imagine, this discovery was devastating, and the divorce process was even worse. After this bitter experience, I completely shut myself off from love. I didn't want to meet any men, didn't want to date anyone, and was completely closed off for fear of having my heart broken again. My girlfriends kept insisting that I should give myself a second chance. They even introduced me to a few potential partners, but that didn't lead to anything. But after almost 2 years, my girls thought that I had lived in celibacy long enough, and without asking me, they created a profile for me on Tinder. At first, I was furious. It seemed to me a complete disrespect that they had done that without my knowledge, but after a long discussion, I understood that they were partly right. It was time to give love a new chance, or at least meet people and have fun. After all, loneliness wasn't the best company either. The girls showed me the app and explained to me how it worked. I'm sure they thought that I would delete my profile as soon as they were out of my apartment. And yes, I was planning to do that too, but I didn't. A few weeks passed, and one evening when I was a little bored and had drunk a few glasses of wine, I looked at the app on my phone and thought, why not? The first thing that surprised me was the number of likes that my profile had. I hadn't expected that, so I started looking through the profiles and photos of those who had seen my profile, but no one seemed interesting. But just as I was about to give up and put my phone aside to continue drinking, I came across his profile. Alvaro. From the moment I saw his photo, there was a kind of instant click. He was very good-looking, dark-haired, with well-defined features, but he also had a charming smile and an intense gaze. I think it was exactly that gaze that immediately attracted me. He had that mysterious and sensual aura that leaves no woman indifferent. Alvaro seemed to be in his 30s and had a fairly short profile description. Lover of nature, art, and nighttime walks in good company, without big expectations. Without big expectations, I made a match with him, and to my utter surprise, I received his first message only a few seconds later. Hello, Paula. I would like to get to know you. Oh my God, I was totally excited. It was just crazy how I felt, because it was someone I had only seen a photo of, but for some reason, this man immediately awakened my fascination. I immediately answered him, and we started talking. We talked almost all night and exchanged numbers. Everything went very quickly. He was absolutely charming and very eloquent. We had many things in common, or at least that's what he made me believe. At the end of our long conversation, he said that he wanted to meet me in person and invited me to a well-known Italian restaurant in the city. That day, I came to work without sleep, but throughout the workday, I thought only of this meeting. I was so excited and eager that I felt like I did on my first date with my ex-husband. When I look back on that day today, I feel very stupid. It's incredible that at almost 30 years old and with a bitter divorce under my belt, I was still so naive and gullible. I came home early to get ready and look stunning for my date. Of course, I chose my best outfit, let my unruly hair loose and straightened it to make it look fantastic, and put on makeup the way I only did when I wanted to impress. All dolled up, I arrived at the restaurant a little earlier than planned, and as I got out of the taxi, I saw him waiting for me in the distance. He was even more handsome in person and was very well dressed. He was wearing a white shirt that accentuated his complexion and dark jeans. He greeted me with a hug and a kiss on the cheek, which immediately made me feel comfortable. Dinner was wonderful. Alvaro was very pleasant and seemed to know a lot about art and literature. Everything was going well until something happened that made me very uncomfortable. A waitress who was bringing our dishes almost tripped, and the food almost landed on him. Nothing happened, but at that moment, his reaction to the girl seemed excessively aggressive. He jumped up and started yelling at her that she was an idiot and scolded her for almost covering him in pasta. He was a big man and stood menacingly in front of the thin, petite girl, almost as if he was going to hit her. She apologized repeatedly, but he didn't stop saying offensive things until I intervened and asked him to calm down. Then he looked at me as if he was only now realizing the situation and quickly changed his mood. He smiled as if nothing had happened and said, "You're right, sorry, sweetheart," directed at the waitress. It was really disturbing. It was a strange and exaggerated episode. He had been so friendly and cheerful that I never would have thought he could have such an aggressive side. From that moment on, the mood changed. He tried to resume the fun and pleasant conversation, but I was really shocked. Nevertheless, I played along to avoid ruining things even further. Besides, dinner was delicious, and he made an effort to make me feel comfortable again. After dinner, he invited me to spend the rest of the evening together, to have a drink or go for a walk, but I politely declined, saying that I had to work the next day, and quickly said goodbye with a kiss on the cheek. However, as I was about to leave, Alvaro took my hand and asked me to forgive him for what had happened. He said that he knew that I was upset because of the incident, but explained that he had had a terrible day and that I had been the only good thing about it. He didn't want everything to be ruined because of a mishap. Then he asked me to go with him to his favorite place, a park nearby, which he said was beautiful to walk in at night. Then I remembered what was in his profile, that he loved nighttime walks. He said he would take me home afterward. For a moment I hesitated, but as incredibly stupid as it may sound, I believed him and said yes, like a lamb going to the slaughterhouse. In 2018, I was a 19-year-old girl, quite ordinary like any other, with ongoing studies, a monotonous job, and a circle of friends with whom I went out on weekends to have fun, without big worries, and with a very positive attitude towards life and the future. But all of that changed radically on a Saturday night when, out of sheer boredom, I decided to embark on the adventure of the online dating world. After a tiring week between exams at the university and my job in a cafe, I decided to relax and treat myself to an evening at home, watching movies on Netflix and eating chips. But after a while, I felt the urge to do something different, something exciting to break out of the routine. So, after some thought, the brilliant idea came to me to download the well-known dating app Tinder. After all, everyone was using it, and I thought it might be fun to meet someone new and pass the time. While swiping my finger across the screen and looking at profiles of men from all walks of life and with different preferences, I suddenly saw his photo on the screen, and it immediately caught my eye. His name was Ivan, and he was really attractive. He seemed a little older than me, but that's exactly what made him even more interesting, because I had never been with older men before. Although he wasn't much older, he was 40 but looked more like his late 30s. He was tall, light-skinned, and had green eyes. He also had a mysterious, almost vampiric aura that aroused my curiosity. I immediately swiped right, and only a few minutes later, I got the notification that it was a match. That meant that Ivan was also interested in me, which made me totally excited, and I felt a tingle through my body when I read his first message. "Hello, Valeria. You are beautiful. I would really like to get to know you. Would you like to go for a drink with me tonight?" I didn't think long and immediately said yes. He asked where I lived and offered to pick me up, but I told him that it would be better if we met directly at the place. It didn't seem very smart to reveal my address to a stranger, so we agreed to meet at a cozy sushi restaurant in the city center. I prepared myself carefully and made sure to wear my best dress. I wanted to make a good impression and look as attractive as possible. I could hardly wait to meet this mysterious man from Tinder and see what might come of it. When I arrived at the restaurant, he was already waiting at a table. The photos hadn't lied. He was really very attractive. But as the evening progressed, I realized that he was not only good-looking but also charming and entertaining. He knew how to have interesting conversations and always had a witty response to my comments. He seemed to be a very educated man and had fascinating stories about his travels around the world. I was captivated by his company. He smelled wonderful, and that vampiric aura I had mentioned at the beginning was even more intense as I sat across from him. I was so nervous that the book fell out of my hands, and the photos scattered on the floor. Ivan turned around and noticed what had happened. For a moment, we looked at each other in silence. My heart began to beat rapidly, and my head was a complete mess. At that moment, my body screamed, "Run away from here." I wish I had listened to my instinct, because that way I wouldn't have given him the opportunity to use his charming and eloquent manner to calm me down with an explanation that could convince gullible people like me. Ivan stretched out his hands without taking a step and kindly asked me to calm down. He explained to me that it wasn't what I thought. He said that it was a spiritual ceremony in which the participants participated voluntarily as a kind of initiation. Somehow, he managed to convince me that there was nothing wrong with it and that he was only documenting these rituals because he had a great fascination for these topics. He assured me that the photos had been taken during a spiritual ritual that he had attended in Scotland. Once again, his explanation wasn't completely convincing, but he sounded logical, and honestly, I wanted to believe him. I needed to. He held out his hand, and I took it. Then he kissed me. That was the first time he had done that. After the kiss, he asked me if I was okay, and said that if I wanted, I could spend the night at his place. But if I didn't feel comfortable, he would take me home. The truth is that when I went to him, I had expected that maybe something more would happen. But after this incident, I felt so confused that I asked him to take me home. Like a gentleman, he agreed and drove me to my building. On the way, we hardly talked, but Ivan occasionally stroked my hand and smiled at me. That smile was hypnotic and made me calm down. But when I got out of the car and he kissed me goodbye, I noticed a strange glint in his eyes that sent a slight shiver down my spine. Despite my concerns, I ignored it once more. When I got home, I leaned against the door and tried to process what I had seen that evening. As much as I tried, I couldn't sleep. The symbols in his house, the photos, the strange markings on those women's bodies, everything seemed like it was out of a nightmare. The next morning, I decided to find out more about Ivan, so I started searching for him on the internet, browsing through his social media profile, and looking for information that could give me a clue about his true intentions, but I found nothing suspicious. Nevertheless, that didn't really reassure me. Something inside me said that I should be careful, but I also wanted to trust him. I really liked Ivan, so I let the matter rest and tried not to think about it further. A few days later, I received a message from Ivan in which he invited me to a party at his house. He said it would be a special night, and he wanted me to be there as his date. At first, I hesitated, but then I agreed. I wanted to forget what had happened and make everything normal again, like it had been before that evening. On the night of the party, I got dressed carefully, chose a nice dress, and waited for him in the driveway of my building. He arrived quickly, and we drove off. When we arrived, the first thing I noticed was that there were more people there than I had expected. Everyone seemed to know Ivan well, and from the beginning, there was a strange atmosphere, almost as if a hidden tension was in the air. Once again, my gut feeling signaled danger, but as always, I ignored it. The evening went on, and at some point, Ivan led me into a separate room. He said that he wanted to show me something important. When we entered the room, I saw an altar with burning candles and, again, those strange symbols that I had seen in his house before. I got a queasy feeling in my stomach, especially when I saw that in the middle of the altar, the same symbols were painted that I had seen in the photos that he had allegedly taken in Scotland. My heart began to beat faster, but I tried to stay calm and not show anything. Then Ivan said that he hadn't told me the complete truth that evening because he didn't want to scare me. He began to tell me about a group he belonged to, a kind of secret society that sought knowledge and power through ancient rituals. At that moment, everything suddenly made sense. My heart started racing, and somehow I knew that I wasn't here by chance. I remembered all the women I had seen in the photos, and everything became clear in my head. Those women weren't there voluntarily. He had brought them there, just like he was doing with me now. I realized that he had been manipulating me the whole time and preparing me for this moment. I asked him what all this was really about, and he smiled in an eerie way and said that I would find out that night. Panic rose within me, but I played dumb and tried to find an excuse to get out of there. But before I could say anything, an older man entered the room who had a very intimidating presence. Ivan introduced me as the special guest, and the man said it was time to start the ceremony. Ivan took me by the arm and led me into a larger, darker room. In the middle, there was a circle drawn on the floor, presumably with salt. Suddenly, many people in black robes entered the room. The air became heavy, and for a moment, I couldn't feel my legs anymore. I tried to break away from Ivan, but he held me tight. Panic overcame me, and I couldn't hide it any longer. At that moment, I saw a slightly open door at the end of the room. I took advantage of a moment of Ivan's inattentiveness to free myself from him and ran towards the door. I ran as fast as I could, leaving my shoes in the hallway, and heard the screams behind me, but I didn't stop for a second. It's incredible what adrenaline can do. I've never been a particularly good runner, but that night, not even Usain Bolt could have caught me. Luckily, I have a good memory for places, and I knew exactly which way we had taken when we went in, so I ran as fast as I could until I finally found the exit. I stumbled onto the street, barefoot, and ran into a Japanese restaurant on the other side of the street. There, I called a taxi that took me to the police station. At the police station, I told them everything I had experienced, but without concrete evidence, they couldn't do much. That evening, I didn't want to go back to my apartment for fear that Ivan might look for me there, so I went to my parents' place. I started researching secret societies and their symbols. In the process, I discovered that the group that Ivan belonged to was known for animal sacrifices, but there were reports that more radical members were also involved in human sacrifices. Unfortunately, I was never able to gather enough evidence to hold Ivan or his group accountable. I blocked his number and deleted my Tinder profile. Fortunately, he never tried to contact me again. 2 years later, in 2020, I learned that he had died in a car accident. Sometimes, karma catches up with people in unexpected ways. After almost 3 years of not dating anyone, after my last love relationship ended very badly, I thought that maybe it was time to dive back into the dating life in the hope that it would go better this time. To do this, I decided to try my luck on Tinder, as I had seen it work well for some of my lesbian friends to meet new people. After a few days of swiping back and forth, I finally had a match with a woman named Sophia. She was not only very pretty, but also seemed pleasant and charming. We immediately found a common passion: old classic movies. That's not a very common preference, so I was thrilled to meet someone who shared this particular passion with me. In her profile, she showed many photos of herself in nature, on the beach, skiing, mountain climbing, and camping. Her biography revealed that she was new in town because of a demanding job, and that she was trying to meet people and make contacts in the area. In view of this, the old movie theater in town, which showed Hollywood classics from the 30s, seemed to me to be the ideal place for our first meeting. I hadn't been there for a long time, mainly because I had no one to go there with, and it was a bit boring alone. I suggested this plan to Sophia, and she seemed enthusiastic about the idea. I suggested meeting on Saturday, but she said that she couldn't wait to meet me, which seemed very enthusiastic to me because it was only 2 days until then, so we decided to meet on Friday instead, which was fine with me too. The next day, we met at the cinema as arranged. She was pretty, although she seemed a little more attractive in the photos, I have to admit, but she greeted me with a big smile, and we kissed on the cheek. She seemed to be a very charming person, and I liked that. We had a great time at the cinema. We watched City Lights by Charlie Chaplin, and during the movie, we had a lively conversation about our favorite movies from that era, and joked about the fact that we might be reincarnated souls of people who had lived in those years. But I noticed that Sophia, who was rather shy and reserved at the beginning and often left me to take the initiative, became more relaxed and talkative as the evening progressed. Gradually, her self-confidence grew, and she became more talkative and charismatic, even telling me very personal details about her new stressful work environment and her annoying colleagues. When the movie ended, I had enjoyed the evening and was ready to go home, but Sophia suggested that we go for a drink at the rundown bar next to the cinema. Up to that point, I had really enjoyed the date and hadn't seen any warning signs with her, so I didn't think anything of it. Even though I wasn't a big fan of alcohol and I didn't really like the bar, but this decision would turn out to be one of the biggest mistakes of my life. When I look back now, I only wonder how different everything could have been if I had simply said no and gone home. But as they say, what has happened has happened. When we arrived at the bar, we sat side by side on a couple of old wooden bar stools, and each of us ordered a beer. Because the music was loud, we had to lean close to talk, but it was at this moment that Sophia began to clearly cross my boundaries, which made me feel increasingly uncomfortable. At first, it was subtle touches, like leaning on my shoulder while speaking into my ear or touching my arm, but as the evening progressed, she went further by placing her hand on my lower back and leaving it there. I had nothing against her, but we simply hadn't built the necessary trust with each other for such touches to be pleasant. It felt like she was going too far, but I didn't want to tell her directly to avoid embarrassing her, so I tried to slide back a little on my chair each time she touched me to signal that I was uncomfortable. Either she didn't understand my signals, or she didn't care if she was embarrassing me. But that wasn't the only thing that bothered me. Gradually, Sophia began to steer our trivial conversation into far more personal and unpleasant areas. She asked me rude questions about my previous relationships, my preferences on dates, and even about topics such as marriage and family things that I wasn't ready to discuss with someone I had only known for a few hours. She went so far as to ask me about my intimate preferences. When I realized that the evening was taking a strange turn, I only answered vaguely and politely to steer the topic in a different direction, as I really felt pressure. In less than an hour, the mood of the evening had changed from entertaining and pleasant to tense, uncomfortable, and really disturbing. As soon as I finished my beer, I told her that I had to go home. I politely put money on the counter to pay for my beer and said goodbye with a simple, "It was nice, thanks for the evening." But when Sophia saw that I was leaving, she finished her beer and followed me. She insisted on accompanying me home because it was already dark outside and could be dangerous. It was only 8 p.m., and although it was twilight, the city center was busy. Besides, I thought that it could be dangerous for her too if she accompanied me all the way home and then had to return alone. So there was no reason for her to accompany me, but she insisted. Her questions, the inappropriate touching, and now her insistence on accompanying me home, I didn't like any of it. But I didn't want to be rude, so I tried to decline her invitation kindly but firmly. But then she said that she had nothing better to do, and that I was the only friendly person she had met lately. Eventually, I gave in. But instead of a pleasant conversation like at the cinema, we walked along the streets in awkward silence. We were heading towards my apartment building, and I was just hoping that this uncomfortable evening would end quickly. When we were only a few meters away from my front door, Sophia suddenly walked in front of me and stopped on the sidewalk. Before I could react, she suddenly asked if she could come into my apartment because she lived far away and stayed with roommates, so she rarely had time for herself. I was shocked. Before I could even realize what kind of proposal that was, Sophia grabbed my wrist. She held it tightly, and when I tried to break free, she desperately pleaded with me not to decline her request and to let her into my apartment. While she was pleading with me, Sophia pulled my wrist tighter and tighter. I was surprised at how strong she was. Despite all my efforts, I couldn't free myself from her grip. At that moment, I felt real fear for the first time and told her to let go of my hand immediately. That distracted her briefly, and in the moment her grip loosened a little, I took the opportunity, tore myself away, and ran as fast as I could to my apartment door. While I was running, I heard her both pleading and scolding me in a disturbing tone. With trembling hands, I pressed the button for the elevator and watched Sophia through the glass windows as she walked around confused on the street until she finally stomped away angrily. I tried to process what had happened. This woman was completely crazy, and now she knew where I lived. I felt terribly stupid for letting her get so close to me. In the days after this terrible meeting, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me, no matter where I went. I wasn't sure if it was just my paranoia or if she was really following me. But my worst fears were confirmed when one morning I left the building to go to work. The first thing I saw was Sophia sitting at the bus stop directly opposite my apartment building. My stomach tightened and my heart began to beat like crazy. I had a panic attack. I immediately turned around, went back to my apartment, and called work to say that I was sick and couldn't come in. I was far too upset to think clearly or concentrate. Shortly after this incident, I came home and found a package in front of my door. Inside was a handwritten note addressed to the nickname I had used on Tinder. Despite my better judgment, I opened it, and inside I found things that reminded me of our date. The movie ticket, a photo of Charlie Chaplin, and a selfie that we had taken at the cinema while waiting for the movie to start. If I had already been nervous before, then I was now completely terrified by Sophia's behavior. It was becoming increasingly creepy. At this point, I didn't hesitate any longer and went directly to the police. I told them everything that had happened and gave them all the information I had: the box she had sent me, our Tinder conversations, and the intrusive messages that she had sent me after our meeting, which I hadn't even wanted to look at after the encounter. Fortunately, this was enough for the authorities to track her down, and they issued a restraining order that forbade her from approaching me or contacting me. I have to admit that even weeks after this incident, after I had received official confirmation from the police that she would no longer be able to come near me, I still had the feeling of being watched. Every time I was out and about, I would turn around and look over my shoulder. This oppressive feeling haunted me for a long time until it finally faded. This experience taught me to be more cautious and to pay attention to the signals that people around me send out. But above all, it taught me not to ignore warning signs, no matter how insignificant they may seem at first glance. Luckily, I have never heard from Sophia again since then. I never thought that my life would take such a terrible turn just by downloading a simple dating app. At that time, I was in a phase of great change in my life. I had moved to a new city, changed my job, and ended a marriage that had lasted 7 years after my wife had cheated on me with her supposedly best friend. Laura had been my girlfriend since I was 19, and we had married 2 years later. I was only 21 when I proposed to her, but we were so in love back then that we were sure that we would stay together for the rest of our lives. But that turned out to be a promise that only I was willing to keep. This experience was a hard blow for me, but in retrospect, I recognized all the things I had missed because I was married. In those years, most of my friends had enjoyed life. They went to parties, met new women, and lived carefree. I, on the other hand, was a married man with all the responsibilities that came with it, and was also studying, which left me little time for distraction. Unlike my ex-wife, I have always respected our relationship, and have not been with any other woman in the 9 years we were together. But after our divorce, I realized that it was time to catch up on some of the lost time and really enjoy single life, without obligations and without emotional ties. A friend of mine recommended that I download the dating app Tinder, which he also used to arrange dates, so I followed his advice, created a profile, and started using it. Through Tinder, I met many women and had some successful dates. I was always very honest about my intentions because I didn't want to play with the feelings or expectations of others. So it came about that about 4 months after using the app, I had a match with a woman named Martha. Martha was dark-skinned, had curly hair, and was very attractive, which immediately caught my attention. We started chatting and soon exchanged our number. She was very charming and liked to flirt in our conversations, which I found very appealing. After a while of chatting and flirting, I suggested that we could meet that same evening. She agreed, and originally, she suggested coming to my place, but I declined and offered to drive to hers. I didn't feel entirely comfortable giving a stranger my address, and she accepted that. I asked her to send me her address. Martha didn't respond to my message right away, which actually should have been a warning sign, but in my excitement to meet her and spend the evening with her, I didn't pay any further attention to it. Besides, I had only had good experiences with my dates up until then. About 10 minutes later, she finally sent me her current address, which was relatively close to my place, so I set off after about a 10-minute drive. The place she gave me was a housing complex in a suburb of the city. The area was quite dark when I arrived and didn't make a very good impression. But since I had insisted on driving to her, I just kept driving to the parking lot and texted her that I had arrived. She replied that she had already seen me because I had described the car that she said I should wait there. She would come down right away to pick me up and take me to her apartment. I followed her instructions, turned off the engine, and waited. Suddenly, I was attacked by 2 men who appeared out of nowhere. They ripped open the car door, pulled me out, and started beating me brutally without saying a single word. They threw me to the ground and continued kicking me. Afterward, they searched me, took my wallet, my watch, and my gold graduation ring. Then, they ransacked the car and took everything that was valuable, including my laptop and my phone. After that, they simply ran away and disappeared into a dark alley. Strangely, they left my car. After the men had disappeared, I lay on the ground for a while, huddled up in pain. The pain was so severe that I had no strength to call for help. Every time I tried to get up, I collapsed again. So I just lay there until I was able to recover a little after a while. Finally, I managed to get back into the car and drove to the nearest hospital. During the drive to the hospital, I thought several times that I would pass out because the pain in my ribs was unbearable. Luckily, I held on and made it to the hospital. There, I received immediate emergency care. After they had taken a few x-rays, it turned out that I had 2 broken ribs, and one of them had almost pierced my right lung. I also had severe bruising in several places on my body. After the treatment and a lot of painkillers, I was released from the hospital 2 days later with instructions to completely rest for the next 2 weeks. Fortunately, a friend helped me buy a new phone the day after the incident so that I could block my bank accounts and change the passwords for my social networks to prevent the attackers from accessing my data or scamming my friends. I also checked my app messages to see if Martha had contacted me after the attack, hoping that she had nothing to do with the incident, but our entire conversation had been deleted and her number was blocked. Her Tinder profile was also gone. It was all a trap, and I had fallen for it. It was by far the worst experience I have ever had, not only in dating but in my entire life. Nevertheless, I haven't stopped using Tinder, but now I'm much more cautious when I meet someone and always make sure that we meet at public places first. After this traumatic experience, I began to thoroughly rethink my decisions and the way I met people through online dating. I was sure that I had to be more attentive when interacting with strangers and that I would never again reveal personal information or my location without a certain degree of trust. A few months after the incident, I had started using Tinder again, but much more carefully. One evening, I received a message from another woman who also seemed very likable and attractive. I had learned from my mistakes and made sure that we met in a public place, a busy cafe in the city center. Everything seemed to be going completely normally. The conversation was pleasant, and she was very friendly. There were no signs of danger or discomfort like I had experienced with Martha. But despite my increased caution, I couldn't completely shake the nagging feeling of insecurity. It was as if the shadow of my previous experience was still following me. Even when I was sure that this new woman had no bad intentions, I felt deep inside that something wasn't right. I began to wonder if the trust that I once had in people was destroyed forever. The encounter with Martha had left deep scars, and I realized that it was not only the physical wounds that took time to heal, but also the emotional scars that constantly forced me to expect the worst in every situation. Finally, I decided to take a break from online dating apps. I needed to sort out my thoughts and feel safe again before embarking on the adventure of meeting people again. Sometimes it is better to listen to yourself, accept the healing process, and take the time to rebuild trust, not only in others but also in yourself.